Thank you. My name is Lori Caruthers-Collins, and I'm the Assistant Director of Diversity Initiatives in the Office of Faculty Affairs and Development at Cal State San Bernardino. I want to thank you for attending this session, creating a more inclusive environment, and again, how to address bias in the workplace. We have several objectives today. And first of all, to increase your awareness of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace, what bias looks like, how microaggressions, and that is a word I want you to remember, how microaggressions impact the workplace and how you can commit to courageous action, because it's not always them who are doing things in the workplace. We have a responsibility as well. And to look at the 8 elements of an inclusive environment. If we were in person, we always like to establish our agreements, and these 4 agreements have come up time and time again, and for everyone to participate because your voice matters. And you'll see in the 8 elements of an inclusive environment, voice. And share the airtime. I think that's the most important one, because we want everyone's voice and no 1 or 2 people to monopolize the time that we have together. And then thirdly, speak your truth without blame or judgment. And then, as you know, we want to respect each other. All right. So I'm going to ask you to jot down a response to 2 questions. And the first question being, what would be your ideal work environment? So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about it and jot some thoughts down. What would be your ideal work environment? So I want you to get inspired by some of these examples, some of which you may be thinking about, have experience with, or jotted down. So some respondents have said more autonomy. And autonomy certainly is a person's ability to act on his or her own values and interests. And supervisors who listen to suggestions. Secondly, an environment that's challenging, that's friendly, rewarding, engaging, collaborative, supportive, and flexible. Next, how about we have highly competent individuals in our workplace who are respectful, who are mature and accountable employees working toward a common goal, where we look and sound professional. I had one respondents say drama-free. And then another responded by saying a supervisor who admits mistakes, never loses his or her temper, and always has a positive attitude and sets a positive example. Our second question is, what are you experiencing that is preventing you from making your maximum contribution? I want you to think about that, and we're going to be chatting during this session to get your thoughts. What are you experiencing that is preventing you from making your maximum contribution? Think about it and jot down some thoughts. All right, these may ring true to you. You may say, I'm experiencing unfair treatment in my workplace. And again, have you, or is there a space for you to communicate that to your immediate supervisor? Or do you have a situation where leaders who don't listen, they'll eventually be surrounded by people who have nothing to say? That's a consequence of a supervisor not listening. And then second one, now thirdly, we want to say to ourselves as well as others, know that a bad attitude is like a flat tire. You can't go anywhere unless you change it. So working for a supervisor can sideline your career by trapping you in a situation where you have no opportunity to advance. Sometimes supervisors may discourage feedback. They disrupt teamwork by encouraging interpersonal politics. Don't want to fall victim to that. And maintain a sharp distinction between supervisors and staff. A supervisor that comes in late and takes a long lunch while insisting that employees arrive to work on time. Hopefully you don't have an environment like that, but some of us have that experience. So one of our objectives today was the language and being aware of the language of diversity and inclusion. So first, our definition of diversity in the workplace is where there is representation from many different groups in terms of race, age, sexual orientation, abilities, disabilities, and cultural background. Next, we have inclusion. It's making it possible for individuals of different groups succeed by creating a workplace that values who they are and what they offer. Again, a workplace that values who they are and what they have to offer, and it provides opportunities for them to develop to their full potential. Remember the earlier question. Then we have privilege. Privilege is granted to people who belong to one or more of these groups: European Americans, able-bodied people, heterosexuals, males, Christians, and English-speaking people. So those are some definitions I want you to remember as we move forward. So when we look at bias in the workplace, again, part of what we're going to do today is learn how to address bias. An unconscious bias or implicit bias where we're not aware refers to a bias that we are unaware of and which happens outside of our control. It happens automatically and is triggered by our brain making quick judgments and assessments of people and situations. So keep in mind, we all bring unconscious biases into the workplace. These deeply subconscious attitudes span race, gender, appearance, age, wealth, and much more. They influence everything from the car you drive to the employee you promote and the ones you don't. And because they are so reflexively triggered without our knowledge, they are virtually unconcealable. So how do we know we have biases? So there's a test called the Implicit Association Test, the IAT. Again, the Implicit Association Test, which is well known, and it's a computer-driven assessment on implicit attitudes, those that are unknown to us. The test uses reaction times to measure people's automatic association between attitude objects and evaluative words. Easier pairings and faster responses are taken to indicate stronger unconscious associations. I would encourage you to take it. It's the Implicit Association Test to see what kind of biases you bring into the workplace. So let's talk about workplace bias and unfair treatment. Most all of us have experienced that at one time or another, in our work environment. So unfair treatment takes many forms, but is a result of the same. Parts of the workplace are unfairly treated and excluded from experiences and opportunities. Again, excluded from experiences and opportunities. So there are two kinds of biases I want to highlight here. One is structural bias, where you have policies and practices in the workplace. And then we've touched on the psychological biases, where some are intentional. We're going to talk about those, and some are unintentional. Those are our implicit biases. Typical policies include stifling feedback and differences of opinion. So a supervisor or work environment may have a practice against negativity and criticism in a meeting, where they accuse anyone with a different opinion of having a bad attitude or being insubordinate. It's important to be respectful in a professional environment, but this should never, ever be used to stifle your feedback. Unfair treatment, different rules for different ranks, rules that apply to supervisors than to staff, emphasizing the chain of command at the expense of productivity and professionalism. All right, so these examples are some examples of biased behaviors, and bias is not limited to race or ethnicity. We have biases against physical ability, against people who are members of different social groups, and also weight discrimination. So one example, if someone is biased toward women, they might display that bias by hiring a man over a more qualified woman. Secondly, if someone is biased toward a certain religion, they may show it by making rude or insensitive comments, or go as far as vandalizing religious buildings. And next, if someone is biased toward a same-sex couple, they might discriminate against them by refusing to acknowledge them or make insensitive comments. A bias in favor or against one thing, a person, or a group compared with another, usually in a way that is considered unfair. So a conscious bias, when we have those, we say that's an explicit bias. We're aware of what we're saying and doing. Or an unconscious bias is implicit. We don't know or aren't aware of it, but again, taking that IAT test will help you discover some of your biases. All right, here, and do you have an example to share? And again, on June 2nd and 3rd, we're going to ask you to put some of your experiences in the chat, and I'll be able to respond to them. Now, let's look at impact. What impact these biases have on us in the workplace. All right, bias impacts the workplace and can appear just about anywhere, but most often in the areas listed here. In the area of promotion, supervisors who limit their employees' movement from one department to another. Bias in recruitment and hiring. Bias happens when you form an opinion about candidates based solely on first impressions. Is it conscious or unconscious? When people make decisions to employ people who they think will fit into their culture, or adhere to the very similar people they already have in their department. I think that's key. Most of us have been on a recruitment committee in our department or other in partner department. Are we more inclined to that first impression bias or other biases when we're hiring people who look and sound like us or who might fit into a workplace environment? How about in compensation? Bias impacts compensation because we do have gender and racial pay equity gaps that exist because of unconscious bias. We have hidden assumptions and beliefs and stereotypes still influence the areas listed here. They're subtle, yet substantial. It may require significant changes in long-standing traditions, practices, or policies to achieve and sustain equity in these areas. Keep in mind as we go through this presentation, don't always think what they are doing to us or refer to them as them, but keep in mind, we're going to talk about some things we can do and how we can empower ourselves to mitigate some of the biases in our workplace. This is an important topic, and this is microaggressions. What they are, we're going to talk about what they look like and what they sound like in the workplace, because a microaggression is a form of bias. So this is the definition of a microaggression. Let me give you a minute to read that, or a few seconds, actually. So microaggressions are everyday slights, indignities, or put downs and insults that people of color, women, LGBTQ, and those who are marginalized experience in their day-to-day interactions with people. Microaggressions often appear to be a compliment or a joke, but contain a hidden insult about a group of people. Microaggressions can make the work environment more hostile. So again, microaggressions, I want you to think about some of the things you've experienced, some of the comments that have been said to you, and do they fit in this category? We have what we call racial microaggressions, and they look like this. Where a white man clutches his wallet or a white woman clutches her purse. As a Black or Latino approaches or passes, that happens in elevators, that may happen on the street. Where an Asian American student is complimented by a professor for speaking perfect English. A woman speaks up in an important meeting, but can barely get a word in without being interrupted by her male colleagues. Remember, males have privilege in our society. These instances happen on a daily basis to people of color. I ask that you recognize them, become more aware of them, and then think about some ways that you can mitigate these biases as we talk about them. So let's look at some racial microaggressions. I'm going to give you a few seconds to read some of those. I've certainly had this one. You don't act or speak like a normal Black person. I consider that an insult. I've also had, why do you sound so white? Insulting to me. Then you're really pretty for someone so dark. And what are you? Where are you from? Where are you really from? No, where are you really, really from? All microaggressions. These are everyday slights, insults, and put downs. So let's look at some themes that microaggressions have, some examples, and the message they send. The first one being color blindness. And that's statements that indicate that a white person does not want or need to acknowledge race. An example of that would be, when I look at you, I don't see color. And to me, that's a huge insult. I am a different color. There's only one race, the human race. Or I don't believe in race. Let's look at the message that sends. Denying the significance of a person of color, racial or ethnic experiences in history. Let's look at the second thing, denial of individual racism, a statement made when bias is denied. I'm not racist. I have several Black friends. How many times have African Americans heard that statement? As a woman, I know what you go through as a racial minority. If you're not a racial minority, you probably don't. Let's see what the message that's sent by those statements. When you deny the personal experience of individuals who experience bias. So some other examples would be tone policing. Tone policing, where people of color are often accused of being angry or overly animated during discussions. This frequently happens to African Americans, although it can happen to other ethnicities. They're often accused of being too aggressive or angry when they're simply trying to make a point that they strongly believe in. Another theme is called name shaming. Can I call you Q for short? Mispronouncing a colleague of color's name or asking if they mind being called something else sends the message that they view the person of color differently. And I remember we have a dean who has a different name, and often people do want to shorten it to make it easier to pronounce for them. But again, it is an insult and a microaggression to the individual. There is not a litmus test for microaggressions. What is considered a microaggression will vary by person, situation, your level of relationship, your delivery tone, history, context, and other factors. Other factors being our experience, our lived experiences, our education, and our background. So a couple ways to address bias in the workplace. You want to stop for a beat and think before you speak. So you don't want to act too overly aggressive. You want to constantly be vigilant of your own biases and fears. But keep in mind, in the workplace, microaggressions may happen to others, may not always happen to you or be directed toward you. It may be directed toward your colleagues. Anytime I hear a microaggression, the little red flag in my head goes up. But you don't want to be too defensive. You want to handle the situation respectfully and use some of the strategies I'm going to talk about today. You want to be open to discussing your own attitudes and biases and how they may hurt others. And again, that IAT test will help you be more aware of some of your own biases. We all have biases. And then lastly, be an ally by standing personally against all forms of bias and discrimination. Keep in mind that microaggressions affect people, and you should be more aware of what they look like and much less likely to repeat them. So how can we create a more inclusive work environment? That's part of our objective today. We all want to work in a more inclusive environment. That would be an ideal. So this is the definition that I've chosen for an inclusive work environment. Let me give you a few seconds to read that. We all want to feel welcome and valued for our contributions. That is so critically important. It's a place where disabilities, and I learned this from a young person, some people have visible disabilities and some have invisible disabilities. Keep in mind, you don't have to self-disclose a disability unless you choose to personally, but they should have the same opportunities for advancement as their coworkers do, visible and invisible disabilities. So we want to discuss now the 8 inclusive workplace building blocks. Before you can build inclusion in the workplace, you need to understand the biases and how people experience inclusion and the traits of an inclusive workplace. These are 8 building blocks and the foundation of an inclusive workplace. The first one being having a voice. When you have a voice, you're more likely to share your opinions. True. We want to experience belonging, a sense of connection, part of the environment that knows and values you. You want to be part of the environment that values you. Next, a sense of uniqueness among your peers. Your individual strengths and experiences do matter. A sense of uniqueness. Next, feeling valued. When you feel that your voice and unique self are appreciated, there's a greater sense of value and satisfaction. You're cherished, you're important, you're special, you're loved and cared for, and you're proud of being appreciated. Learning and development, where you have access to learning and development opportunities, and this conference is one such opportunity for professional development. Next, a collaborative environment. Again, the old adage is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Regardless of your role, staff or supervisor, a collaborative environment can break down silos and promote organizations that have wide inclusive policies and practices. The next is access to resources, like support from supervisors or diversity and affinity groups, help you know that your organization is committed to your well-being and growth. And then lastly, this is strategic alignment. It requires organizations to explain why an inclusive workplace is important so that everyone could put strategy into action. You know how all of our departments and divisions have that strategic plan? Well, again, in order for a strategic plan to be a success, you need people to implement it. And so it's important that everyone can put a strategy into action. Won't happen without people. So these are a few things I want you to remember on your road to awareness. Again, how to address bias and how to create a more inclusive workplace. When we have prejudice and stereotypes, for and against characteristics formed without an individual's awareness. Remember, implicit bias is unconscious, explicit bias is conscious. And being aware of the unconscious biases can start to reduce our reliance on generalizations and stereotypes. We want to hold decision makers accountable, including yourself. Accountability is the key. You want to survey employees confidentially. You can do that in a variety of ways to find out what is really going on in every aspect of the employment process. So you can take a survey, informal or formal. And hiring, promotion, and career opportunities and compensation become part of that inclusive workplace. So a couple things you can do to challenge bias. An inclusive workplace requires proactively managing unconscious bias. And hopefully after this session, you'll be more aware of what it looks like and what it sounds like in the workplace. Our workplaces have a culture. So we want to include practices to change the culture if it's not a conducive one. We want to open doors of opportunity. Again, if I hear about a professional opportunity, I'll say, hey, would you like to be a part of this with me? I think we could learn a lot. And gestures of inclusion and caring. We want our colleagues to display that. And we want to reward employees who engage with affinity groups and bring out the best in the workplace culture, because affinity groups can provide additional information and perspectives that we can bring into the workplace. An inclusive culture indicates a climate. Remember, climate is important in our workplace, in which respect, equity, inclusion, and positive recognition of differences are cultivated. Having a voice, feeling valued, belonging, and that your contributions matter. You matter. A level of supportive energy and commitment from leaders all contribute to an inclusive culture. Let's look at the area of job performance. Some of these policies are in place in our CSU system in terms of job performance. You always need to be aware of what criteria you are being evaluated on in advance. Sometimes you're asked to do self-assessment, and that's always helpful. But we want to establish clear criteria in advance of making decisions, so bias is taken out of the decision-making process. We typically have an evaluation form. You want to make sure you understand what you're, again, being evaluated on. Identify those performance measures, set guidelines for feedback. It is not okay for supervisors to evaluate you and present it to you and just ask for your signatures. Again, feedback should be ongoing so that your evaluation won't be a surprise. And if it is, please challenge that in a way that is respectful, but ask for clarification. You want them to give balanced feedback and outline expectations for improvement and give you a timeline for doing so. When supervisors personalize the job performance reviews, that's not a good thing, because they use them as tools to enforce subservient behavior. We don't want to feel subservient. We want to feel included and being a partner and important in our workplace environment. So another thing you can do is commit to courageous action. And I always talk about courageous conversations. Again, you have to think about it. You have to sleep on it. You have to pray on it. You have to talk about it with a colleague before you engage in courageous action. Sometimes there are spaces in our workplace to do so, and sometimes they aren't. I would suggest that if you want to be courageous in a public setting, that you might want to expect some pushback, but I always say a courageous action or courageous conversation in private can be more effective in the long run. Sometimes uncomfortable adjustments are needed to create workplaces that work for all instead of some. What is the difference you want to make? Each of us can make a difference, and together we can make change. We want to promote self-awareness. So recognizing one's biases, again with the IAT test, or other instruments that assess biases is the first step. Remember, IAT is implicit, unaware association test. Understanding the nature of bias is also essential. Opportunities to have discussions with others can also be helpful. There are individuals we work with on a daily basis who we may not know well, and so having discussions with them will help with that. We want to focus on seeing people as individuals. We want to work on consciously changing your stereotypes. Take time to pause and reflect and adjust your perspective. The question you should ask yourself, what are you committed to doing? So a few sound bites I want you to remember are: what you ignore becomes more. What you tolerate will soon take over. What you permit, you promote. And what you challenge will change. I'm going to give you a few seconds to maybe jot a few of those down. I really think they're important. So I have some final thoughts. And there's a phrase I want you to read and absorb. So ask yourself where these biases come from, what they mean, and what can we do about them. We can have revised or modified policies and practices that place certain groups at a disadvantage. So think about the policies, but more so the practices in your department. Assess yourself and your organization about diversity and inclusion, and take some courageous action. Admit to be committed to change as opposed to indifference and silence. What you ignore becomes more, which can reinforce discrimination. A change in behavior can modify beliefs and attitudes, and hopefully an organizational culture. Taking a test of hidden biases may be helpful. It can be easy to reject the results of the test and say, oh, that's not me, when you first encounter them. But that's the easy path. To ask where these biases come from, what they mean, and what you can do about them is a harder task. The very act of taking the test can force hidden biases into the conscious part of your mind. But nothing can be changed until it is faced. Although there is no roadmap for undoing overt and especially hidden stereotypes and prejudices, conscious attitudes and beliefs can change. If people are aware of their hidden biases, they can monitor and attempt to rid themselves of attitudes before they are expressed through behaviors. Rid yourself of an attitude before it is expressed through a behavior. The compensation can include attention to language, body language, and to the stigmatization felt by target groups. If people are aware of their hidden biases, they can monitor and attempt to rid themselves of hidden attitudes before they're exposed through behavior. This compensation can include attention to language, body language, and the stigmatization felt by target groups. So these are some resources I want you to consider purchasing, checking out from our libraries. One is called Diversity Beyond Lip Service, and we want to think of these in terms of what we can do, how we can make a change through courageous action. So Diversity Beyond Lip Service is a good read for all concerned with the question of human training, leadership development, and organizational change. Secondly, Lead from the Outside is how to build your future by making real change. Stacey Abrams has a story to tell, but she also has strategies that I think would be helpful. Emotional Intelligence 2.0, EQ, provides a step-by-step program for increasing your emotional intelligence by using 4 core skills: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management, and belonging at work. These are everyday actions you can take to cultivate an inclusive organization. Remember, it's about accountability. Accountability on our part plays a huge role in creating an inclusive environment. This is my contact information. Please feel free to, as Californians say, reach out to me via email or by phone. And one quote I have on my emails is, "Our lives begin to end the day that we are silent about things that matter." Again, ask where your biases come from. Be aware of microaggressions in the workplace. You may address them publicly. Sometimes that is warranted, or privately, because that may go a long way, because people may not be aware of their biases. And if you bring it to their attention in a respectful way, it may help to create real change in your work environment. Thank you, and I look forward to interacting with you on June 2nd and 3rd.